Hi everyone. In this video we're going to go over problem D on page 52. So again, the problem is asking us to use the Pythagorean identities to simplify this problem. Sine squared times 1 plus cotangent squared. Remember that the Pythagorean identities are right here. On page 51. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is turn it over, because I'm going to run out of room, and do it on the back side. Notice I color-coded each term. That's to make it easier to see what we're doing later on. So remember that when we have a number outside of parentheses, that means we need to distribute that number to everything inside. In other words, we need to multiply this term, sine squared, by everything inside the parentheses. So we need to multiply sine squared times 1, and we need to multiply sine squared times cotangent squared. In other words, this is equal to sine squared times 1 because I just multiplied sine squared times 1 plus sine squared times cotangent squared, or sine squared times cotangent squared. Okay, so just as a review of what I just did, I took sine squared and multiplied it to everything in the inside the parentheses. So sine squared was multiplied to 1, and sine squared was multiplied to cotangent squared. Okay, so sine squared times 1 is just going to be sine squared, because any number times 1 is just itself. I'll bring everything else down. So plus sine squared times cotangent squared. Okay. Now, looking at the problem, we can't really combine anything because these are not like terms. We can't cancel anything out yet because nothing cancels or simplifies. So now we want to refer to our identities. Remember that cotangent squared is the same thing as, well, cotangent is the same thing as cosine over sine. So we can replace cotangent squared with cosine squared over sine squared. So let's write cotangent squared as cosine squared divided by sine squared. Again, that's just because cotangent is equal to sine over cosine over sine. And cotangent squared then is the same thing as cosine squared over sine squared. I'll go ahead and bring everything else down. So times sine squared plus sine squared. Okay. And remember that when we're multiplying a fraction by a number, we can put that number over 1 and just multiply it straight across the top and the bottom. So sine squared times cosine squared just gives us sine squared times cosine squared on the top, or the numerator. And the bottom, or the denominator, we have 1 times sine squared, which is the same thing as sine squared. Okay, I'll go ahead and bring everything else down. Okay, now does anything cancel out? We have sine squared in the numerator or the top of the fraction, and we have sine squared on the bottom or the denominator of the fraction. Sine squared divided by sine squared is just 1, so sine squared cancels out. Because any number divided by itself is 1. So now we have sine squared still, plus cosine squared is all we're left with in this fraction. So now we have sine squared plus cosine squared. Now this might look familiar to you. Remember that sine squared plus cosine squared, used looking at our Pythagorean identities, is actually the same thing as 1. Because sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So we can go ahead and replace sine squared plus cosine squared with 1. So again, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, because by our Pythagorean identity, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And 1 is definitely simplified completely. And that's it for problem D. So our answer is just 1. In the next video, we'll go over problem F on page 52. Till then, see ya.